Okay, hello. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I was just being muted by my host, but we've now muted that. And so you should be able to see me. Video in the top right hand or top left hand corner, and hopefully you can see the first slide of the presentation. If you can just give me a raise of hands, please, at the bottom, just so that you can identify that you can hear me, please. Yeah, that's great. Good. Okay, so everyone can hear me, everyone can see me. Welcome to our first webinar. This is one of 3 that we have planned. I hope that all of you are well. I hope that you're all safely at home and that your families are well. Unusual times, obviously, for everyone, but hopefully these little half-an-hour coffee breaks will just break up your day slightly, emails that you can clear in the morning, work that you can do after here. And like I said, we'll just keep these to 30 minutes. So our second webinar is next Thursday, the 30th of April, 18th edition wiring regulations given by Simon Hobbs. And it's a whistle top stop tour, difficult to say, but it'll give you some insight into the updates that have come out. On the 7th of May, which is the following Thursday, Greg Jarvis is providing an EV charging update entitled For the Less Informed. So that again just basically uses Greg's knowledge from some of the recent seminars and courses he's been on and updates you on some of the EV progress that we're doing. Actually, after that, we're going to introduce some EasyWeb seminars as well. So those of you that use our portal, we've updated this year to a new version 5, with new features, and my colleague Matt McDonald will be giving you some tutorials as well. So we'll get some details out in the future for there. So right, without further ado, let's begin this presentation. It's a presentation you may have seen before. Don't switch off because I've updated it. The previous presentation was written in 2016, and actually it used statistics that I'd gleaned from data that we'd generated from 2011 to 2015. So 5 years later, we've got new statistics. We have seen new trends, and also my car has had, well, it's finished as well, which it wasn't done the last time I presented. So let's get into it, okay? Apologies. Right, so here we go. So if you remembered the first time I gave this presentation, I told you about the 1980s. I'm 46, so I kind of grew up during the 1980s. They were my formative years. So I still, unfortunately for some, listen to the music from the 1980s. My heroes, sporting heroes, were all from the 1980s. The films, I thought it was a great era. So it was kind of heavily influenced me really during that time. One of the things that I had a big passion for back then were the cars, and it wasn't necessarily supercars, you know, the poster cars that we all had in our bedrooms, the Lamborghinis, the Ferraris and so forth. I was kind of really keen on the production saloons and the hatchbacks. I thought it was a great era where Ford could produce a run-of-the-mill Sierra and they'd put a Cosworth engine in, or BMW just had a standard E30 saloon and they'd put a 4-cylinder Formula One engine at the time into the original M3. The Lancia Delta was very similar. So kind of walking to school, and my head was turning left and right when these cars were going up and down. So I always had a passion for those, always had a want to try and buy a car like those. Didn't have the chance when I was driving. Obviously trying to insure these things back in the day was quite a challenge. So I had to wait, and I waited until I was 40. And at that time, I thought, right, this is the time we're going to do it. I'm going to buy myself a 1980s sports saloon. And I bought myself a 325i Sport, and you can see it here. This is taken probably about 2 or 3 weeks after I bought the car at the back end of 2013. So I'd seen the car on eBay. I'd followed it for a couple of months, and I'd watched the price come down. So that's probably telling me something that it wasn't selling and there were issues with it. Anyway, I contacted the seller. around my birthday, which is the 22nd of December. Is it available? Yes, it is. Agreed on a price. It was £3,250. Paid the deposit of £250 and agreed to pick it up on the 30th of December. And at that time, I'm great. I've called my colleague, Greg. I said, Greg, I need to go and get a car. Not too far. It's just up near Newark on the A1. He agreed to do that. It wasn't. It was actually north of York, but I thought if I told him that, he might not take me there. So we then drove up on the Saturday and I picked the car up that you see. And I knew it was a project car. That wasn't a problem, but it was really tired. It had done 130,000 miles, but it hadn't been abused. It had just been used as a daily works vehicle. And coming back down the A17 and back into Norwich on the A47, the car was, the engine was tired, the suspension was soft, there was quite a strong smell of petrol, and I knew there was going to be some work to be done. But I had no problem with that. So locally to us, there's a really good classic car restorer, and I took it to him, and he had it for half a day, and he went through it. He had it up on the ramp, he test drove it, and I went back at the end of the day, about 5 o'clock, to pick the car up. And that's the car he described to me, which obviously looks different to the one that I had, but obviously that's not my car. And the reason he described the car similar to the one that you're seeing is because he told me to start again. Okay, and the reason he said start again is based on this assessment here. And if you have a look down on the left-hand side, this was in July the 3rd, 2014. I'll just bring some of these up. Rust damage to the front balance, okay? Rust damage in the near side wheel housing. Offside rear inner wheel housing, extreme rust damage, near side wheel housing, and arch rust damage. Everywhere we looked, it was rust, it was rust, it was more rust. So clearly the car was heavily corroded. So really the right thing to do was just to put it back on eBay and go again, but I didn't. I wanted to restore the car. So that's what we did, and we came up with a plan to do that. And these are a few photographs really sort of just detailing the restoration. And on the top left, as I'm looking at the screen, you can see where we've taken the body kit away from the sill. There's quite heavy rust coming through there. You've got rust here by the driver's side front wing. Top right is the passenger's footwell, where we've cut away most of the metal because it was heavily rusted there. Going down from here, you've got the driver's side quarter. So that was removed and the inner and outer arches were replaced. You've got a large boot section here, and then you've got the near side quarters. So the car was rotisseried, as you can see on the bottom left-hand corner. So we tackled all the rust in here. And then obviously new panels were put on, bare metaled, and then finally primed. So that kind of happened over a 2-year period, sort of 2014, 15, and took us really to when I last gave this presentation, because the car that you see on the dolly was how I'd had the car finished when the presentation was written. And that's the car painted. It then went back into my garage for another couple of years so I could save up again to then get the car out, get it rolling by putting on the suspension and putting on the running gear. And then bottom right-hand corner, it went down to a specialist in Sussex who then rebuilt the car. So it needed a lot of new parts. Those went back on and it was finally finished last summer. And I was really pleased, really proud that the car was considered for an article in Classic Car magazine under epic restorations, because it certainly was an epic restoration. But that's really bringing you up to speed. If you had seen the paper before on the situation, so the car's now running. It's here today in the office. It's outside, giving it some exercise in this nice weather. But all along the time of doing the car and experiencing the amount of corrosion, the amount of rust, and the poor condition of a car that was 25 years old, that's when I started to make comparisons between my car and a lighting column. seeing columns coming into the office, seeing columns being reported on a daily basis on our channel, it had some very striking similarities. My car, like a lighting column, had spent 25 years outside. It had spent 8 of those 25 years in Scarborough. So it was based on a coastal location. So exposed to high winds, exposed to salt air, exposed to salting of roads. My car is what they call a Tech 2, a Sport, and what that has is a body kit which is wrapped around the bottom of the car. And when we took that away, then most of the corrosion was from trapped debris, from moisture. And again, really similar to embellished columns and decorative columns that hide defects and can cause problems. The difference being, after 25 years, my car was scrap. So apart from taking off the alloys and selling those and some of the parts that were desirable, the shell was scrap. Different in our industry, 25 years, we're only getting going with our lighting columns, and we're pushing them out now, demanding more and more. We're going with LEDs that are now 25 years themselves. So we're asking a lot from our columns to look after our lighting infrastructure. So that gives you an idea on the car. I'm going to go into some of the columns that we see, like I said, on a fairly regular basis, and just show to you that column failures aren't necessarily just in one specific place. And it's in many respects an ever-changing environment, because columns can fail in different areas, in different places. There isn't often a trend. Columns next to each other can be fine. A column that's in between them can fail. Here's just a few that we've seen over the last couple of years. Rooted columns that generally fail at ground level. That's a fairly vulnerable area, certainly on sort of urban areas where you have dog walking routes, where you have potentially strimmer activity, different ground conditions. But they're not just limited to ground level failures. Here you can see failures that have happened below the cable entry hole. And in this circumstance here, fell below the cable entry hole, even though you still had fairly significant roots and base section, the column has failed. So obviously, this is something that we're concerned with. We see these on a regular basis. We also see swage failures. And interestingly, due to potentially some of these high wind conditions we've experienced in February and March, unfortunately, I've seen 3 or 4 of these come through. And again, making a comparison to the car, very much like that body kit that's wrapped around the car. Here you have a potential where you have a lip, an inner lip, and over a period of time, you have moisture just sitting on this lip. And due to a column potentially being maintained, so you might have a column that's been painted, so externally it would appear in good condition. Internally, it might be a very different story. And unfortunately, where sometimes you can see a root section failure, it might be a soft lean. It's one that you might be able to get a maintenance crew to before it's catastrophic. In the cases of swage failures, there's generally no warning. If there is warning, it might be one that you can see here on the bottom left-hand screen. Unfortunately, if you can get to it before then, you can save a potential collapse. But those are a concern. And we continue to test and find these and look for these within our testing programs. So we looked at rooted columns, we looked at swage columns. Here's another interesting scenario in that we're seeing more and more column bracket and extension issues. One of the reasons for that is that historically most testing regimes have ignored high level testing, because basically the test is performed at the base. Or if you're using a different form of test method with maybe a mechanical arm, then you're not getting that mechanical arm to a height where some of these are failing, which is at 10 meters, potentially a little bit higher. The only way you're going to see these is if you're going up there to do a lantern conversion and you're doing some installation works. That's all well and good if you can then identify it and react. It's not very good if they're failing before then. But again, much like a swage column, where you've got potential for moisture to sit on a lip, for it to be hidden from view, and then over a period of time, combined with the fatigue that sets in on a column due to our weather conditions, then again, you can have a pretty catastrophic failure. That's 3. Here's 4, plated and embellished columns. And like I said, it's not just one failure, it's a multitude of failures that we see. But again, very difficult to test, very difficult to determine. So plated columns on the left, you have a plate and a root section, and you can see where the root section is welded to the plate. And then you have a plate and a column, and the two of those are attached and they're installed into the ground. The only issue is over a period of time, the two plates and the column can separate themselves from the root. And here's a pretty horrific photograph, really, where there is just no root section left. So there is nothing to support that column. And again, you can't test those columns from above ground level. You can only test them by excavating and actually exposing that root section. So now you're treating this exercise in the way you would treat a service transfer or column installation work. So if you're almost going to that degree of inspection, then you may as well go to the point of replacing the column. Embellished columns, again, just like the car, they hide defects, they trap moisture, and unfortunately, if they're not picked up and they're not identified, then there is a potential to fail. And they're not just 5-meter columns like the one that you can see in the middle. It's affecting columns which are much larger. To the right-hand side, we've got a 10-meter column, and that is a pretty significant catastrophic collapse when it does happen, because they're big units. So there's 4 really of varying different fails: rooted, swages, plated, embellished, and sort of bracket and attachments. Going to show you this. This is a video that hopefully will run. Just keep your eye on number 15. So that's 15 miles an hour. And you can see the column moving. It's going from side to side. It's a windy day. You've got the foliage on the left-hand side. And there we go. So if you haven't seen a column fail, that is a pretty shocking video of one that has done. It's a big unit. It's got 2 very large brackets and lanterns on. And if I just try and play that again, the CCTV camera is moving. It's a high wind day. The foliage on the left-hand side. Amazingly, this falls between 2 rows of parked cars. So really fortunate that no one was injured, and no cars were damaged, and there were no reported fatalities. So that's what we're out there doing. We're out there testing columns to prevent this from happening, and that's why it's important that whatever testing regimes you have, you maintain, because that's the severity of it. I mentioned the fact that that column's gone down. It was a defective column, I'm assuming, because it had a point, a weak point, but it was certainly brought on by the weather conditions on that day. It doesn't have to be a defective column for it to fail. This, when it came out in the back end of 2018, I found quite fascinating, really, because it illustrates the damage that attachments can do, and I'll say unapproved attachments can do when they're installed to columns and they're exposed to high wind conditions. So this is a new column that's installed, and it's a pair of solar panels that have been attached back to back on the shaft. And on a high wind day, this is up near Scotch Corner up on the A1, the force that wind is applied to those panels has snapped it clean at the shoulder. We can't say that the column was aged. We can't say that the column was fatigued. We can't say the column had internal corrosion. There are no defects. It's come from the factory. It's been installed. Obviously not approved to have the solar panels attached. But that's just an indication of the kind of weather conditions we're submitting our lighting stock to, and what can happen to a column that is naturally newly installed. And going on and talking a little bit about the weather, we experienced Storm Doris back in February 2017. And I said to you that we'd experienced 2 or 3 swage fails in the early part of this year. So if you could snap a column with a solar panel in high wind conditions, well, vulnerable columns that are exposed to some of these conditions will be affected too. So here you go, February the 7th, you've got a Met Office warning for strong winds and an amber warning right the way through to the Sunday. 4 days later, you've got another severe weather warning issued on the 11th of February. 5 days on from there, you've got a red warning is issued. High level of impact. I think it says it's the highest level of rain they'll see since 2015. And then on the 27th, you've got 65 to 75 mile an hour winds. So they were coming, if you remember, they were almost every weekend during February, or certainly every 4 or 5 days. And that was something that certainly prolonged wind conditions can have issues with lighting columns. Interestingly, Storm Doris, we had reported wind speeds of in excess of 90 miles an hour in Norfolk. So, like I said, the reason I mention this is that predominantly we're managing an aged infrastructure in this in the UK, and we're exposing that infrastructure to increased weather conditions, and it's making it difficult for our lighting stock. It makes it even more difficult when we've got attachments, and that's the theme of this really, is that you've seen a solar panel fail on a column that was newly installed. You've seen some of the weather conditions that we've experienced in the last 6 weeks, or certainly prior to this nice weather period we've had. And lots of the columns we're seeing, or lots of the columns that we're shown that have failed, have a telltale sign. So they're defective for a start, so they've got internal corrosion, or they might have a loss that's identified in the base or the root section, but often it's got a sign, or 2, or 3, or it's got a large bracket and an oversized lantern. Not necessarily a column that's been designed to take that in the first place. So attachment fails are a concern, and certainly in these weather conditions, we need to be aware of that. And if you are managing stock that 1 is aged and 2 is defective, it's good to check that you haven't got columns with unapproved attachments on. Just going on to some of the protected columns, bitumen coated, spray coated columns. We've got a new document that we're working to, GN22, which has superseded TR22. And although it's not saying that every column now has a 40-year assumed residual life, it is saying that there is an actual working life for many columns of 40 years. We don't disagree, because certainly clearly columns will go further than the 25 years that EN40 recommends. But this is just an example of 2, one with root protection that failed within 16 years. And the middle one, a column that had spray coated protection that was manufactured in 98, installed in 99, and that failed in 2018. So 17 years for that column. So even columns that are protected are vulnerable. It's not just mild steel columns, it's those that have had some form of protection that are still potentially liable to fail. And this is just a stat. It's really interesting. Those of you that manage a non-PFI stock, you'll probably agree that we have between, and when we see our testing data, 60 to 70% of your lighting stock will have installation dates of 1990 and older. So predominantly your lighting stock, 2/3 of it is now 30 years and older. So like I said, we are managing an aged infrastructure. And just finishing off our slide, it's not just steel columns. We see failures from all over: concretes, casts, and that's aluminiums. Now, generally an aluminium column will give you a 50-year lifetime warranty. We've seen aluminium columns fail. We've seen interesting aluminium columns fail as you would expect a steel column to, with signs of corrosion, which is unusual. More commonly, aluminium columns that would split around the door aperture. So there's an example of a variety of column fails. Obviously a video that shows the nature of a catastrophic collapse as well. A lot of them are linked to high wind conditions. A lot of them are linked to having attachments installed. But what I want to move on to, I've just got another 6 or 7 slides and another 5 or 6 minutes left of the half an hour, is some statistics. And I said to you that I wanted to update you on the statistics and what we're seeing. So this is just a very simple statistical spreadsheet that we run here in our business. And I used this spreadsheet in my first presentation, and the calendar years ran from 2011 to 2015. So I've used 2014 to 2019 to capture a 6-year cycle. Lots of our clients will perform the structural inspection and testing with an electrical test and operate a cyclical regime, which just basically levels out the number of tests they do year on year. So there's some really good information on here, and I'll just run through this with you because it's quite interesting. good and bad. The good news is the industry is testing columns. So you can see that the number of structural tests that we're completing is increasing. So the general consensus is that it's an issue, the column condition is a problem. So not only are we being put to site to test columns, so are other structural test houses as well. Interestingly, and I'll come on to this in a minute because it's really important, the number of red failures are remaining consistent. So it's generally around 2%. And like I said, we'll mention this in another slides that follows here. Red upgrades is something that we've introduced within the last year, and this is something that we've done with well-managed highway. So we're taking a risk assessment and scoring the column now. And if we put some components together, so the column has multiple defects, the column is in excess of 8 meters, the column is not protected, and it's on a high-speed road, then it has the potential to be upgraded from an amber grade to a red upgrade. So if you classify those reds together, then you're at around 2.5% and 42,000. I'll skip the ambers for a second and go on to the greens. 47% of all the lighting stock we've seen in the last 6 years has come out as a green tested column, and 16% as a green visual column. And the difference being is those visuals will be concrete columns that we've not been able to test with our dipstick equipment. So 63% of the lighting stock that we've seen from these 1.6 million columns are green. That leads me on to the middle one, which is the amber. So 26%, a quarter of everything we test falls into this amber category. So a column that doesn't have a green pass and a 6-year retest date, but not necessarily a column that we're saying you need to replace within the next 3 months. We can give you a 3-year period to retest it. The issue with the 26% is that it totals up 442,000 units across those 6 years. And the reason it's a problem, I'll show you now in the next slide. Because if we follow TR22, which was the only guidance we had previously to GN22, if we'd identified a red column, it was telling us that we had to action that column within a period of 12 weeks. So it says here, supports identified as at high risk should be actioned immediately. Well, they're the columns that we're phoning in from site and you're coming out to on the day of the test, imminently dangerous columns. Or replacement within a safe time frame. So they're the ones that we're emailing through and advising as being red. And you would have had 12 weeks to do those. Those 42,000 red columns that I showed you on the previous slide, at £1,500 a column is a bill to our client base of £63 million. And if you took that over the 6-year cycle, that's 10 million a year. Well, our clients have a budget to rectify those red columns. If you spread that cost out across all of our client base, they're on top of those reds and they're replacing them. The 26% of amber stock that amounts to 440,000 is the issue, because that £660 million bill that you need to find, you need to go and replace, isn't there. The funding's not there, the budget's not there, and those columns are being left. And they're being left for the next test, and they're being left for the next test, and they're being left for the next test. And they're being subjected to these weather conditions that we're seeing, and potentially they're being pushed and sweated out. And that's the problem, and that's where this presentation goes really. It sort of just summarizes that our clients deal with the reds, but you've got a lot of ambers that are stacking up behind there. And as an industry, we need to find a funding source to go and identify this and potentially get another PFI regime in place. The reason we need that, I'll show you in the next slide, because it identifies a client that is working on a cyclical basis. And if you look down to the bottom of the slides and you go to the very first year, which is 2006, it says group 3. And interestingly, you've got this group 3 identified 3 times. So it's 2006, 2012, and 2018. So that is the same inventory, except for 2% of that lighting stock that's been replaced because it was identified as red. And it's about 35,000 assets. So those 35,000 assets that we tested in 2018, give or take a few that were replaced, are the same as we tested in 2006. Look at the difference in the column condition. you've gone from a 43% green to a 16% green. Not only have you gone from 10% high amber, that's gone to 32%. So the trend, if you look right way across those years, is these ambers are going up and up and up, and the greens are going down and down and down. And the concern is, if there isn't budget found, and this is very similar for all of our non-PFI clients, then you're going to have a graph that's going to look like this. And we've just calculated that by 2031, at this existing rates of deterioration, pretty much going to lose the lighting stock. So unfortunately, in these unsettling times, we're looking at a lot of graphs at the moment, and we're looking at a lot of curves. Well, this amber curve isn't good. It's not flattening, and it needs to just tail off and flatten, and we need to get this green curve to go up. So there's some statistics that's showing to you that as an industry, our lighting stock is going. We're losing control of it. We're dealing with imminence, we're dealing with dangerous, but we're not dealing with the defective columns which sit behind there. There is a way that we can do this. It's going to need some change. It's going to need some work with the authors of GN22, but we've retired TR22. That went last year. And our new document, the ATOMS document, Asset Management Toolkit, has replaced it. And it's called Guidance Note 22. And it's used a lot of risk assessments and risk scoring from a code of practice, well-managed highways. And the reason we can use this document with some manipulation and some help from the authors for funding is that it's designed so that we can do that. We can report a score on our lighting stock, and then we can put that forward for funding to a central body. It doesn't quite work at the moment, and I'll show you why. So within that document, we have something called a CCI score. And this CCI score is a score that is generated for an area. So you might have a ward, or you might have a zone, or within a large authority that's split up with maybe 12 different districts. You can then obtain a score for that district, and you can compare that score against other districts. You might compare it against a coastal district. You might compare it to a city or a town district or something similar. And the idea is that we obtain this score, and then once the whole of the country has got a CCI score, it'll go through to a central body, and then that central body will hopefully allocate funding based on the score levels. The reason it doesn't work, and the reason that it needs to consider structural testing, is that it's just purely based on a visual inspection. And if you look down to the spreadsheet at the bottom, we have assessments that are made to the foundation, to the flange, to the holding down bolts, to the column base, the column shaft, right the way through to the luminaire. And then it's graded from A1 as being perfect to E5 of having basically an imminent or a red, so an extent of greater than 60% in defect across a large area. However, when we've taken visual inspections and put it through the spreadsheet, and we've run CCI scores, the scores have generally come out very high. So an area that we know isn't particularly good, that has issues, is actually telling us that it's scoring close to 100, in this case 97, and has an excellent outcome, and wouldn't therefore be considered for funding. Here's a little comparison between the two, and like I said, it doesn't quite work at the moment. It needs to consider the test results. On the left-hand side, you've got an area that considered 1,734 assets, and visually, one of those was classified as red. However, when we structurally tested those, 37 were root section defects. So they're defects that were identified with the equipment that you wouldn't have found with a visual inspection. Not only that, you have 340 amber defects. The majority of those were testing defects, because on the left-hand side, you only had 206 that were classified as good. So what I'm saying is you can have a CCI score that says that you have a good condition ward or zone, but if you structurally test that area, it's a different story. So be careful. We'll get in touch with the authors of GN22 and identify this, because unfortunately, the document that is published is GN22. The CCI score will be the score that will be submitted to a central body, and this will be our form of funding allocation going forward. So it's in the interest for everyone here to try and get funding to replace amber columns, that we're not incorrectly stating the condition of the stock. So we're coming up to 35 minutes. I did say half an hour, so apologies for going over the time. I've got 2 slides that I always just finish off. If you do have any questions, just please put them forward now, if you can, and then Simon will come back through and then we can answer those. But I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you an update, 1 on the car, 2 on some interesting column pictures and a video, and some statistics which, as you can see, show a problem that's looming. But I'll just finish off and just ask you, as I always do, but I just changed the car this time. When was the last time you saw one of these? It's a classic Mark II Escort RS2000. And I'm saying to you, it was probably 1989. But however, this car has just surfaced because it's been pulled out of a barn. It's obviously not been stored very well. And I have been told that someone is going to undertake a restoration, but a very brave person they are. So, like I said, any questions, happy to answer those. If not, I wish you all a
Yeah, James, it's Simon here. We have got a few questions.
Okay, good.
Yeah, like James said, if you've got any questions, because we've got quite a few attendees on here, there's a Q&A box if you want to type them in, and we'll put them to James. So the first question, well, actually, the first thing is an observation that you'll be pleased to know that one of the attendees, Keith, also had a 325i Sport, but his was in dark grey.
Okay.
And I've got a question from Jack, who has asked, do you see a difference in the lifespans between columns that have protective coatings and those without?
Yeah, Jack, thanks for that. Yes, generally, the last 25 years, we have galvanized columns. They've been installed as galvanized. So if you look at those slides, most of the column failures are mild steel, but we have seen failures for columns that have had what I would say inferior protection, so a spray coating. However, I would say bitumen coated columns and root protected columns shouldn't fail. But we showed you a slide there which clearly had a ring of corrosion right the way through that protected area. Whether it was damaged on installation, and that's something that we've seen before when you have columns on a flatbed and the galvanizing gets compromised, whether they're installed poorly and again the galvanizing is damaged, we do see that as well. So like I said, the majority of the failures will be unprotected, but we still see columns fail that aren't.
Okay, I've got another, as an observation type question, just for any of the attendees. Just Matt here has said that he's had a few trouble accessing the first 15 minutes and missed that and so on. The presentation will be sent out on a link to everyone that's attending, so you will be able to dive back into this at a later date if you need to. I've got a question from Stuart. Is there a reason why the areas that can be covered by NDT supersede those visual results as part of the CCI scoring under GN22? So I think that's a question around why the NDT perhaps isn't included within the scoring of the CCI.
Well, I mean, if we go back to the spreadsheet, Stuart, they're just really simply, there isn't an option there for us to actually input our root section test results. So unless you were to manipulate the spreadsheet and use column base, but again, you've got a shoulder here, but no swage areas. So I think the spreadsheet itself isn't set up to take test results, as in structural testing results. It's purely just set up to take inspections. We'll just read something here. I've got GN22 with me, and the authors are really keen to get this CCI score out as a financial tool. It says here, the CCI is a qualitative measure of stock condition used to develop financial strategies for future maintenance and investment. So that's clearly saying that they're trying to obtain a score which can give you the potential to apply for funding. The data collected is considered objective and therefore comparable from location to location and asset owner to asset owner. So in simple terms, you know, if you are Swindon Borough Council and you're comparing your asset data to Gloucestershire or Wiltshire, then you'll basically be in a league table of performance. And that's how the funding will be attributed. Like I said, it doesn't tell the full picture because what it's eliminating from the score are structural test results. I will just say we mapped over the data for one area, and it was over on 11,000 units. Well, they had 900 root section losses, which were ignored from the spreadsheet. And it gave such a difference in two pictures, really. An area that did need investment, however, visually it didn't appear to be in poor condition, so the score was high. So this needs work on, and like I said, something that we'll do certainly during this lockdown period is engage with the authors of GN22 and try and get them to look at CCI again, because it's not telling the true story currently.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions. And there's a few specific questions that are maybe related to work that we've done. For those people that have asked those questions, I think what we'll do is we'll reply specifically to you rather than on this forum. But a more general question is, how common are swage failures versus root failures? That's from Nick.
Do you know what, Nick? I'd say I've probably seen more root failures up until these high winds of February and March, where, like I said, I think we've seen half a dozen in total. A couple that we've actually tested, they're columns that we've worked on, others that have just come to us from clients that have identified them. But then I look at our statistics, and I think if I go back again on the slides to the number of tests we've carried out, and it's something like 370,000 tests. Just go back again.
Just while you're going back there, James,
Yeah.
Paul's made an observation in the video that whilst it did miss nearly all the cars, it looks like it did actually catch the back of one of the nearest cars. So if anyone wants to watch the video again in the presentation when we send the link out, keep an eye out for that.
So obviously I've shown you some photographs because I think it's good to see how columns visually appear when they do fail. But if I look at the number of tests we're carrying out, and last year for us to do 376,000 tests and to be identified a small handful of failures, shows that whilst there is issues, there are problems, the percentage of columns that are falling down is still very, very small. And like I said, those high winds without question contributed to some swage failures during the early parts of this year. And some of those were attributed to attachments, much like the solar panel, which, as I said, if that can snap a column in half that's newly installed, you can imagine what it could do to a column that's been in the ground for 40 years, that has fatigue, which is untestable. For us, the fatigue is an element that we can't determine and has certain defects on them. Then yeah, they were not unexpected.
Okay, I think the last question I've got here is from Simon, different Simon. What dictates the score a column gets? And I think this is for the GN22. So what could be visibly different between a B1 and a C1, for example? That's a good one. Enjoy that one, James.
Yeah, no, it's just extent. It's extent of defect, and that's the thing. So as you increase the score, you increase the extent of the defect. So a lower score would be a smaller size defect. A larger score would be, I think, an E5 would take it over 60% of the surface area. So it's based on the extent of the defect.
Okay. I think that's it for all the questions. So just to say goodbye now.
Okay, like I said, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Come and join us next Thursday as well for Simon's paper, and stay safe. Look forward to seeing you all when we're back out on the road and back to some form of normality. So take care, everyone.